The flights are about 20 wines. So you go from lightest to heaviest.
That's a good tip for regular tasters too. You drink up in terms of the sensory impact. Otherwise, if you do it the reverse, the wines will suffer by comparison. They'll taste wimpy.
Exactly. And then you also work with the tasters so they have their own preferences. If you're tasting wines from the Jura, the red wines are so much lighter than the whites. You normally start with the red wines, not with the whites. The whites are really what they do. And that was basically my job for 2 years.
Do you have a thirst to learn about wine? Do you love stories about wonderfully obsessive people, hauntingly beautiful places, and amusingly awkward social situations? Well, that's the blend here on the Unreserved Wine Talk podcast. I'm your host, Natalie McLean, and each week I share with you unfiltered conversations with celebrities in the wine world, as well as confessions from my own tipsy journey as I write my third book on this subject. I'm so glad you're here. Now pass me that bottle, please, and let's get started. Welcome to episode 205. What's it like to work at the prestigious Wine Spectator magazine and Sotheby's fine wine auction house? How can you distinguish real wine from the fakes? And what's the secret to putting together the perfect wine flight? You'll get those tips and stories in my chat with Aleks Zecevic, who hosts the Vintners podcast. Now, on a personal note, before we dive into the show with the continuing story of publishing my new wine memoir, Wine Witch on Fire, Rising from the Ashes of Divorce, Defamation, and Drinking Too Much. The last legal issue I'll share with you for now is the difference between copyright infringement and plagiarism, since this also plays a part in my book. So copyright infringement happens when you use somebody else's work and label it as such, but you don't ask permission to use it. So for example, posting a chapter of a book on your website and attributing it to the author. Whereas plagiarism is trying to pass off someone else's work as your own. For instance, posting that chapter on your website and then pretending you wrote it. Neither of these examples are from my memoir, by the way. You'll have to read it to find out what actually happened. So the interesting twist on copyright law in both Canada and the US is that it allows for the use of copyrighted material without asking for permission if it falls under certain categories. And those categories are criticism, review, commentary, or education. There are about 4 or 5 others. So for example, if you're writing a book review, you can quote short passages from a book as examples of what you're critiquing. Most people confuse copyright and plagiarism, and very few understand the exemptions under copyright, which is one of several reasons why my dumpster fire in 2012 blew up so quickly on social media. Now I'll share a review from a beta reader, Stephen Lane. He lives in London, England, and he is also the author of Dragon Vine. Quote, Natalie has crafted her experience into what could pass for an unput-downable thriller. It's all the more jarring because it's based in fact. I love the tension and fast-paced writing. The flow of her writing is superb, easy to read without unnecessary detours and distractions. It would be easy for an author to be self-indulgent when writing about something so raw and emotional, but she definitely avoids this. The story is supremely relatable. Her vulnerability and emotion pours off the page. We've all fallen in and out of love at some point, with our work and with others, and while the details differ, the feelings are shared human experiences. The witch references throughout and connections she makes to her own state of mind and emotion are powerful. The title is thoroughly appropriate. There's a good balance of humor and self-deprecation. I reveled in the tone of each chapter, some more somber than others, which kept the overall book approachable without getting too melancholy, despite the tough experiences she chronicles. And what a heartwarming ending. Having been in the food and beverage side of the hospitality business for decades, I can tell you this book strongly resonated with me, as I'm sure it will with many others. A gut check of our own relationship with alcohol is always beneficial, though often overlooked, as wine consumption has become so normalized, particularly within the wine industry. Natalie's heartfelt recounting of her own personal journey made me reflect on all the slights and challenges the women in my life have probably endured and continue to endure. Any man who has a daughter, sister, or mother should read this book. Women with a little witch and fire inside them will enjoy it too. I just love those last two lines. 5 stars. Thank you, Steve. I've posted a link to a blog post called Diary of a Book Launch in the show notes at nataliemaclean.com/205. This is where I share more behind-the-scenes stories about the journey of taking this memoir from idea to publication. If you want a more intimate insider seat beside me on the journey, please let me know that you'd like to become a beta reader and get a sneak peek at the manuscript. Email me at natalie@nataliemaclean.com. Okay, on with the show.
Aleks was born in Belgrade, Serbia, and emigrated to the U.S. for his last year of high school. And after completing studies in marketing and philosophy at St. Francis College in New York City, as well as WSET courses, he worked at the Wine Spectator magazine, becoming one of the lead tasters there. His next job was just as prestigious. He joined the renowned auction house Sotheby's as a fine wine specialist. Currently, he reviews Austrian wines for the Wine Enthusiast magazine, and he's part of a newly founded Vintners platform, which we're going to hear more about. And he creates content and hosts the Vintners podcast. So glad to have you with us here, Aleks. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
All right, cool. So let's start with some of the personal stories that you've collected along the way from your travels in the world of wine. I was particularly interested in one when you visited François Pinon in Vouvray, France. Tell us first where Vouvray is, for those who are not familiar, and what it's famous for.
Sure. So I was covering Loire Valley at Wine Spectator, and at my first visit, I wanted to kind of like go all over the region. It's a huge region, spans from Nantes in the west all the way on the Atlantic Ocean, all the way to the middle of France. So kind of imagine like 100 kilometers south of Paris.
Wow.
It's a really huge region. So I just wanted to go everywhere. Vouvray is somewhat in the middle. It's famous for wines made out of Chenin Blanc. Historically, a lot of sweet or off-dry wines were made there. And in the last years, we're seeing more and more dry wines. It is famous for its limestone soils, but it's a little more complex than that. You can't just like say it's all limestone. There are some nuances there, of course. And the vintners a lot of them are really growers and farmers, and they like to express every single plot. The wines are kind of like broad. They have high acidity. They're usually really generous with fruit, but are also very good at expressing that minerality and the soil in which they grow. So visiting Vouvray, I wanted to visit François Pinon because one of the Vouvrays that I really liked, how I got into Vouvray was a François Pinon 1998 Vouvray, and it was spectacular. I was actually blinded on it, and I got that it was Vouvray.
When you say blinded, what do you mean? Blind tasted?
Yes, exactly. So we were having dinner at a restaurant in New York, and it was at Racine's, which doesn't exist anymore now. It's taken a new form called Chambers. But on Mondays, they did like a industry night, so everybody could bring their own bottle free of charge with some wine people. And a friend of mine brought a bottle of this and served it to all of us blind. And I guessed it correctly, which I'm actually not as good at this game. So I'm very proud of this. Anyway.
You guessed it correctly. Wow, that's amazing, though. Like you're skipping over it a little bit in all modesty, but it is hard to guess. And so what were they expecting you to guess? The grape or the region, or how specific?
Yeah, it was completely blind. So I didn't know anything. And, I tasted it and I thought to myself, is this Riesling? And it wasn't Riesling because the acidity wasn't just as high.
Okay.
I realized that wine had a little bit of age. Riesling also shows petrol notes with age. The older it gets, the more of that like petrol, paraffin you get. So yeah. I was thinking this is not really Riesling because it didn't really show these notes, but it had the fruit, it had the acidity, and it had the minerality, which really comes out after a decade or two of aging. Huh. So I took a wild guess, kind of an educated guess, and it was correct. I didn't guess the year correctly, but I said mid-90s, which was almost there. So
my gosh.
Yeah.
That's amazing. I hope you got a medal or something for that, or at least another top up pour.
No, this was very casual, so I just managed to impress my friends.
That's important.
Anyway, back to the story. It was François Pinon Vouvray, and I wanted to visit the winery, and I knew that the winery had a lot of history. There were growers, first and foremost, not like a huge corporation or anything, really a family-ran winery. And I was greeted by the son, Emmanuel, who's like now running the winery. And, he showed me around the vineyards, he showed me the cellar, as all the tours go. And then we did the tasting, and he prepared a 1945 Vouvray Mulot, which is sweet. And I was very, very grateful, but I also wanted to know more about the wine. And I was asking him how was the vintage, because honestly, I really don't know much about, vintages in the 40s and around World War II and all that. And obviously, it was very interesting, 1945 being the year that World War II ended. And we know that, France was really affected by the war. So I wanted to know more. And he said, well, hold on one second. My grandfather, who actually harvested the grapes, is still alive. And I would love for him to join. He doesn't speak English, but I can translate. So he brought the grandfather, who I'm not 100% sure, but I think he was about 97 at the time. And I'm not sure if he's still alive. But the man was like still very sharp. And they started talking in French and translating to me in English. And he was saying that it was a great vintage for botrytis. So for the noble rot, which develops on the grapes, and they produce the sweet wines out of it. And they called it victory vintage because obviously the war was ending. And it was great because, in previous years, they had to give some of their wines to the Germans, whatever they were producing. It was kind of like hard times. So this was really a happy year for him. It was a good vintage for the wine, and the wine just tasted absolutely unbelievable. It was incredibly fresh for a wine. So this was back in 2018. So if I do quick math, that's, I don't know, 70 something years.
Wow, that is incredible.
Yeah.
That it still tasted fresh.
It was very fresh. And I mean, obviously, it was showing some tertiary notes, but the acidity was still there, and it still had some of those primary fruits, which was just incredible to me.
Oh, what a story. That's great. And to meet the man who made the 1945 victory vintage. Wow. Good year for wine. Great year for France and its allies. That was indeed the end of the war. I love that story, Aleks. That's really great. Now, you have another family-related story about visiting Martin and Anna Arndorfer in Austria. So, again, give us a little bit of context before you tell the story. What are they famous for?
So Martin's family has been making wine in Kamptal for quite a while. And his parents, they're making kind of like conventional wines, more price-driven, historically just not super expensive wines. Martin and Anna met. They're a couple, obviously, now, husband and wife. And Martin did a lot of internships, obviously. They both did. But he did an internship at a winery in Italy where the producer, the grower, was working without synthetic sprays, without adding anything into the wines, without filtering or refining the wines, and just maybe adding a small dose of sulfur. And to some of the cuvées, he was not adding sulfur at all. And Martin was like, well, that's very dangerous. Why are you doing all this hard work in the vineyard and you're not adding sulfur? You're not protecting the wine. And this Italian guy said, well, you'll see. The wine doesn't really need it. I add it when it does need it. And this was kind of like a pivotal point for Martin to realize that he can make wines like this, especially in his region, because of the naturally higher acidity in the Kamptal that you get in the grapes and the lower pH, which helps inhibit bacterial growth and just prevents flaws naturally. So him and Anna started working on this project. And in early, I would say 2010, I think, they really went full throttle making natural wine. So today, they're one of the leaders. I actually just recently wrote an article because I visited them about Lower Austria, and I think they're one of the leaders of the natural wine movement in that part of the country. And I really like them. They're a really fun couple to hang out with, and also I like their personality. They're very relaxed. A lot of wineries, when you go visit them, I feel like they have a structure of how they show you things, whereas with Martin and Anna, it's always a little more relaxed, and you're doing, you can ask them to do whatever you really want to see. So on my first visit back in 2017, we were doing just this, and we were just sitting in their tasting room, tasting and talking. about all sorts of things. And Anna was kind of babysitting their cousins and also their own children. But at some point, all the children just walked into the tasting room with white bed sheets over their heads, and they were pretending they were ghosts and they were trying to scare us.
So cute.
So I started laughing, and Martin realized that I was not fazed by this at all, that I kind of thought it was cute. So he started playing with them, and then I started playing with them. So, after you know it, we were all pretending we were in this game of ghosts and being scared or whatever.
Oh, that's so great. That's so great. And then he was out harvesting at one point. He was on a forklift, you mentioned. Just the integration
Yes.
of the family is so amazing here. What was he doing on the forklift?
It's really cool. So at some point a little bit later, somebody came to pick up a pallet of wine that they were sending. I don't remember exactly where. And he said, "Oh, hold on 1 second." So Anna just left the baby with us. The baby was sitting with us in the tasting room. He grabbed the baby and he went onto the forklift. He was driving the forklift with one hand and holding the baby in the other hand and just smiling. I actually have a video of this. It's one of my favorite memories.
That is great. Talking about multitasking parent. Holy smokes.
Yeah,
I love
exactly.
it. I love it. Don't drop the baby or the wine.
No.
No. So what was the moment you realized you wanted to be a writer, Aleks?
So I've always liked writing, but Serbian being my first language, I always felt more comfortable writing in Serbian. And I was writing in high school. When I moved here for college, I was writing some poetry, and I started writing poetry in English just for fun, just for me. And I started working at Wine Spectator. It was kind of like I was working in wine. My brother used to own a wine shop. That's how I got into it. And then I worked at several different wine shops after this, several different wine bars. And I really wanted to stay in wine, but I didn't really enjoy the late hours of retail and hospitality industry.
Sure.
At the wine bar, like sometimes I would finish at 2 o'clock in the morning, 3 o'clock in the morning. And I just never really had time to see my friends. So if my friends wanted to hang out, they would have to come to the bar where I'm working. So it's not really a fun experience, in my opinion. So I started looking for a job where I can still work in wine, but I have quote unquote normal hours, 9 to 5, working at an office.
How did you get that job? Hang on. The Wine Spectator is one of America's or the world's most prestigious wine magazines. How did you land that job?
So really, it's a very humble response, but it's reality. I signed up for this like newsletter, basically. Nicolas Palazzi, who is a famous spirits importer in New York, was sending out these blast emails for, kind of industry emails with all the tastings or job opportunities in the industry. And this is, back in 2012, 2013. So we didn't have all these websites where you can just go now and like find all these jobs. It was either somebody recommends you or you go door to door or this email that I was receiving. And I got an email one day that Wine Spectator and Wine and Spirits were hiring. And I thought to myself, oh, it's a magazine. That sounds cool. So let me apply, and there were very entry-level positions for both. However, Wine and Spirits was more geared towards writing, whereas Wine Spectator was more geared towards tasting wine. I applied for both. Wine and Spirits didn't work out. I didn't have enough experience being an editor at the time. But Wine Spectator hired me. Bruce Anderson, who was a tasting director at the time at Wine Spectator, who also later became one of my mentors, we clicked and hired me. And yeah, that was back in 2013. Wow. It sounds very humble. I just started working as an assistant tasting coordinator.
And what did you do?
So I was basically checking in wines that were coming in. So at that time, Wine Spectator was covering about 20,000 wines a year. And majority of them were reviewed in our New York office. So Wine Spectator has office in Napa and has an office in New York. So there's a whole team behind checking in wines and setting up tastings because all the tastings are conducted blind. So the reviewer does not know the producer or the price of the wine. So somebody needs to set up the tasting. And it sounds kind of simple, but there is a little bit of skill that needs to be involved. You need to know the wines. You need to know the producers. You need to know the region. So in order to put the wines in correct order, usually the flights are about 20 wines. So, it's kind of like a game. You go from lightest to heaviest or whatever, depending on the flight.
That's a good tip for regular tasters too, mere mortals. You drink up in terms of the sensory impact. Otherwise, if you do it the reverse, the wines will suffer by comparison. They'll taste wimpy or whatever.
Exactly. And then you also work with the tasters, so they have their own preferences. Some of them, like, for example, if you're tasting wines from the Jura, even when you go visit the producers in the Jura, because the red wines are so much lighter than the whites, you normally start with the red wines in the Jura, not with the whites. The whites are really what they do. So, you kind of would have to work with the tasters a little bit as well. And yeah, that was basically my job for 2 years.
Oh, wow. And were you working with Esther Mobley at that point, who is now the columnist for the San Francisco Chronicle?
Yes. So when I started, Esther was executive editor's assistant at Wine Spectator. Executive editor at the time was Thomas Matthews. And she worked closely with him. And then she got promoted a little bit after I joined to be one of the assistant editors, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
And then she landed that amazing job at San Francisco Chronicle.
Oh, yeah. She's been doing so well there. Holy smokes.
Because I believe John Bonet was leaving the position at the time and she replaced him.
Huh.
I'm pretty sure. I can't tell you exactly. But yeah, she left. And I think she built a great career after that. I mean, she became really famous. And Esther was always a person who really loved wine. We went to a couple of dinners together for work. Loved talking to her about wine. You could tell that she wasn't just there for writing, where a lot of editors at Wine Spectator are first and foremost writers, and wine came as a second thing, whereas Esther was definitely a writer, but also really kind of like living and breathing wine as well.
Oh, that is interesting. And so then how did you transition from being the tasting coordinator to being a lead taster yourself at the Wine Spectator?
So one of the interesting things at Wine Spectator is that the company tries to push their youth up, right? So
promote from within.
Exactly. And some senior editors were leaving. Some spots were opening for reviewers. So they organized this tasting, basically like a test for anybody who wanted to become a reviewer. And I think about 10 of us took this test. The test consisted of, a little bit of theory, but a lot of tasting. So we would score the wines that were already reviewed by Wine Spectator reviewers and try to write a tasting note, describe the wines, give them a score because Wine Spectator reviews on a 100-point scale. And I passed this test, and several months later, they asked me if I would like to start training. Then after you pass this test and you start training, it's a 2-year apprenticeship program. So basically you're tasting for 1 year, you're tasting with all of the reviewers at the magazine, in New York office. You sit down once a week or twice a week with one of the tasters. You taste the whole flight with them.
How many would that be? How many wines would be in our flight?
So it depends on the taster. I would say anywhere between 18 and 30 wines.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
It also depends on the tasting. So if you're tasting Barolo, it's probably going to be a lower number of wines than if you're tasting Sancerre, for example.
Sure. Harder on the palate with all those tannins in the Barolo.
Exactly. The tannins, the acidity, especially because everything that you review is pretty young. It's just released or not even released to the market yet.
Sure.
So the wines are, not 100% ready yet.
Yeah.
So you taste with each editor. And then after 1 year, they basically see what your strengths are, what you like. And they kind of assign a country or a region that you should cover.
Wow. It sounds like a law firm where, the junior associates, they're promoted to a specialty or something. It sounds very organized, but also intimidating. Were you intimidated? Like, how did you feel going through this whole process?
Well, I felt very humbled and honored to be a part of this program. So honestly, I was kind of on the high. So I never felt intimidated. And I think what really helped is I had a great relationship, as I mentioned, with Bruce Anderson, who reviews wines of Piedmont, Burgundy, Tuscany, and so on. And even before I started this program with them, I would stay after. This is one of the great perks of Wine Spectator. You can stay after the end of your workday and taste all the wines that were reviewed that day.
Wow.
So I was tasting my first 2 years, probably, I don't know, about maybe 200 wines a week or something like this.
That's amazing.
Or maybe 100 wines. I don't know exactly. It doesn't matter.
Yeah, sure. But lots.
A lot of wine. A lot of times Bruce would stay there and taste late. And because he was tasting regions that I really loved, he also was covering Germany before me. He started, I think, with Germany at Wine Spectator. So we had a very similar taste in wine, so we clicked on that, and I would stay and wait for him to finish his tastings because I would really like to taste Grand Cru Burgundies or some of the
Oh,
best
sure.
Barolos.
Yes.
So
I'd be willing to work late for that too. So it's okay. I'll stay at the office.
Exactly. So I didn't mind waiting sometimes until, 6:30, 7 p.m. Everybody else left, and I would sit there. And I think Bruce liked that and appreciated my passion.
Yes.
So he would really take the time after the tasting when he's unbagging the wines. I would basically taste all the wines with him. Bruce used to study geography, so he's really into maps and geology and all that. So he would pull out the maps, show me different soils in the vineyards. Why is this vineyard better than the other in Burgundy, for example? Why is this Grand Cru? Why is this Premier Cru, even though they're right next to each other? And so on. And it was a great learning experience.
So that difference between Premier and Grand Cru, were there certain things that you noticed when you were looking at those soils? Like, what did differentiate the two?
So it's the Grand Cru vineyards normally come from poorer soils, so they don't have a lot of topsoil. The vines are suffering a little more. And thus the berries that grow in these vines have a little more concentration.
Right, they're tinier. They have to struggle to survive, which makes better wine, perversely
Exactly.
or conversely. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, that's the idea.
Yeah.
So the wine just has more complexity. And, these vineyards were designated hundreds of years ago by the monks in Burgundy. So this is something that we've known for a while. It's nothing new. So yeah, I was never really intimidated by this process of tasting and reviewing wines. And after a year of my training, because I showed a lot of interest in German wines, one of the wine shops where I worked had a huge German wine collection, also Austrian wine selection. And so I really knew a lot. I was very comfortable tasting German wines and Austrian wines. And at that time, Kim Marcus, who fortunately passed away earlier this year, he was a reviewer for Germany and Austria at the time, and he decided to move back to California where he was born. So he moved to the Napa office, and as he was leaving, he suggested that I take over his regions. So it was a great honor, and I'm so thankful to Kim for it. And basically, for the next year, I was just tasting German and Austrian wines with Bruce, who used to review them before Kim. So we were tasting them side by side. At first, all the notes were published under Bruce's name. And then I started taking over. And I believe in 2017, I fully took over Germany and Austria.
My goodness.
And then a year later, James Molesworth became the reviewer for wines of Napa. And, he had a full plate of all the wines because he was already tasting Bordeaux and Rhone. And he was also tasting Loire in South Africa. So he wanted to kind of pass Loire in South Africa to somebody else. And they gave these regions to me. And I'm super grateful for the opportunity that I had. I loved the wines of the Loire, and South Africa I kind of learned to love, and I went to visit the country, and it's one of the most beautiful wine countries
it is
that I've ever visited. So,
isn't it? Especially the Stellenbosch wine region. But this is quite a meteoric rise. Like, would you get, once winemakers especially realized you're the lead taster for these regions, would you get lots of requests and emails and things?
Yes.
What was the reaction from the wine industry?
Well, so with the German producers and Austrian producers, they already kind of knew me because I was going to a lot of events and kind of showing my face. So, and I think how, Kim and Bruce, how they presented me to the people they knew, they were saying that I have a lot of passion for these wines. So yes, I was getting a lot of requests, and, I visited Germany, I think 5 times. I went to Austria, probably also 4 or 5 times for wine. So that was good. Loire in South Africa was slightly more difficult to get the contacts, but I think once I started meeting people, it also developed, and it was great. I really enjoyed all my regions at Wine Spectator.
Wow, great. And then you topped it off with going to Sotheby's, which, along with Christie's, they're the 2 big wine auction houses in the world. Why did you leave the Spectator and go to Sotheby's?
So the Spectator leave was kind of bittersweet. I was there for 7.5 years, and I was just kind of ready for the next challenge. There were a lot of changes happening at Wine Spectator, and I kind of always wanted, working at Wine Spectator for 7 years, I was tasting a lot of wines, but most of these wines were young. And if I was tasting wines that were kind of ripe, or maybe ripe is not the right word, but aged enough to be matured to be their best in their peak, I would normally taste these if I go visit a winery or if I'm at a dinner. So it was kind of seldom. I felt like one thing that I was missing in my wine career was tasting a lot of older wines. And I thought that, an auction house would be a great way to taste a lot of older wines without having to spend a lot of money.
Exactly.
And Sotheby's actually reached out to me a year before I started working there. They had a position for something that was called like a content manager or something like this. However, the company was sold to Patrick Drahi, and with all the changes within the company, they shut down that position. They didn't want to hire anybody. So in the end, that fell through. And 2020, the pandemic started. We weren't really going into the office that much, and I was kind of like ready for a new challenge. And then one day I just saw that Sotheby's was hiring, and I basically applied for this job thinking it was a great opportunity.
And what was the job?
So it was a fine wine specialist. Basically, you inspect wine collections from collectors that we would later sell in auction. So you would go either to client cellar and go through the cellar, price the wines that they have to offer. And also, when I say inspect, you don't really taste the wines. I mean, you do some, not all, but you basically inspect that, firstly, the wines are not fake. This is a big problem for the high-end wine industry. There are a lot of fake wines. I mean, I think if you haven't seen Sour Grapes, it's a pretty good documentary. And there are a lot of stories like this. So that's one of the things that we would inspect for. And there are a lot of tricks, how you can tell that the wine is real. And then also...
Oh, share some. What things were you looking for?
So, for example, when you're Petrus, very famous Bordeaux house, there is just like the way that the key, for example, that St. Peter's holding is printed on the label. It's very precise. There are these fine lines. There's the dots. Then for the DRC, for example...
Domaine Romani-Conti?
Exactly. Domaine Romani-Conti. The dots are not dots. They're actually kind of like diamonds. So you can only see that with... I actually have a magnifier here. So you see, you use a microscope, and it's kind of like a detective work, and very, very interesting. I mean, there are many other wineries and lots of different tricks, but these are just some of them. And then another thing that we were inspecting for is also, if the wine was stored well. So, and you can tell this by the color. So, if the color is kind of gone completely, probably the wine is not good anymore. The fill level sometimes is too low. You probably don't want to sell this.
It's oxidized or whatever. Something's happened to it.
Exactly. So, and you can see this very easily with a flashlight. If you put a flashlight directly on the bottom of the bottle, you can see the color, and also, you see everything, the sediments. And this is also another way to tell if the wine was fakes, because a lot of fakes are actually done by, for example, somebody would put on the label, it's 1961 Petrus, but they actually they have the real bottle, but they would fill it up with the current vintage of something, or like make a little blend. And obviously, a wine from 1961 has a much lighter color than a wine from the 90s, for example.
Sure.
So if the color is not as light, you should raise a question whether it's real or not.
Wow. So did you spot any fakes during your time there?
Absolutely.
Oh, yeah? Okay.
I can't talk much,
sure, because
this is a bit confidential, but there were a couple of collections where, we went into the cellar and we were really sad, that the wines are not real. So.
Oh, my goodness. And what was the most expensive wine that you ever evaluated or tasted?
I really am not 100% sure what the most expensive one is. I've had, 1961 Aubryon is very expensive. I had some...
From Bordeaux, yeah.
Exactly. I had some old Domaine de la Romani-Contis, which are very expensive. I think that winery fetches the highest numbers.
What does it get at auction, like a Domaine Romani-Conti? I know it depends on the vintage, but...
Sometimes $20,000, $10,000.
Per bottle?
Yes.
Holy smokes. Wow.
Yeah. I mean, one of the reasons why I left Sotheby's later is because I realized after several months that this is not really something that I appreciate. I think a lot of these wines are treated not as wine, as a drink, but more as an investment or a commodity.
Sure.
And it's something that I'm not very happy about. As a matter of fact, Domaine de la Romanée-Conti is not like their wines being auctioned. So a lot of times when you're auctioning their wines, you will notice this. Most of auction houses, because every bottle is numbered, most of auction houses would blur or hide the number or just put a generic number there because the winery can trace who they sold the wine to and so on. So they would take you off the list.
Oh, yeah,
Exactly.
because they would get off the allocation list because they're all allocated. Their sales are done. It's not like they're looking to sell more. So yeah,
Exactly.
I can see that. If someone's flipping it to make money, like flipping houses or something, they cut them off. That's interesting.
One of the clients that I met basically told me, he says, I buy 3 cases of wine. And he says, I drink one and then I sell the other 2. And I basically drank 1 case for free and also made some money on top of it.
Self-funding seller that way. Yeah.
Exactly. And so, sure, that's a great strategy. And I have nothing against these people, but it's not something that I do. I come from a culture where you drink wine as part of dinner, or it's kind of like, if you look back at wine, what is wine? To me, it's an agricultural product. Cultural being a very important word here. I think wine is part of culture, just like food is.
Yes.
I'm not going to sit here and say like, oh yeah, I don't enjoy food. There are a lot of problems in the world where hunger being one of them and so on, but I definitely enjoy food. I kind of live to eat. A lot of people eat to live.
No, I'm with you. When we plan a vacation, our family, first I book the restaurants, then we see if the flights are available. So it's all about the food.
Exactly. I'm not saying that I'm better than these collectors or anything, but
sure.
It's just I like wine for what it is. And for me, it's not a commodity. It's not an investment.
Absolutely. But before we leave Sotheby's, I'm just wondering, all of these bottles are so old and so on. How were you able to taste them? Because you don't want to open them, or are you opening one in a case or?
Yeah. So one of the things you would do is, if the cellar consists mostly of, I'll just, make something up, Domaine de la Romanée-Conti 1990, or I don't know, Aubryon 61, you want to taste one of those wines. You also want to taste wines that were most likely purchased at the time when the cellar was built, collector cellar.
Okay.
To see, consistency, temperature, how the wine was preserved and so on. So we would always select several bottles that we would taste that would kind of like show if they were stored properly, to make sure that, if we had a couple of times, sometimes you don't know if something's fake. You just have a feeling that it might be. So you want to taste it just to make sure.
Sure.
So we would select, depending on the size of the cellar, we would select several bottles that we would open and taste. And also, a lot of times we would also select some of the bottles that we would present at dinners before the sale to other collectors, to other buyers, so they can also see the condition of the wines that they're later bid for.
That's quite an investment on behalf of the seller, who has to obviously forego those bottles for tasting purposes, but I guess that's due diligence.
For sure, but it's part of the game, yes.
Yeah. Okay, cool. All right, so now let's go on to, we talked about Wine Spectator and Sotheby's. You're now writing for The Wine Enthusiast, and you talked about how wine is important as a part of dinner. You're also very keen on wines of origin, and there's a big debate in Europe right now about that. Maybe give us a bit of context about what that is and why it's important.
Wines of origin, you mean by like law?
How they define it and how that matters to wine drinkers, without getting too legal or technical. But yeah, you're digging into that issue right now.
So, a lot of countries and a lot of regions have, historically, you have famous names or like names that you would put on labels being recognizable by wine drinkers, as this is like, for example, I don't know, Vouvray Chambertin in Burgundy. It's a renowned appellation. So, a lot of governments would basically put in rules what Vouvray Chambertin should taste like.
Mm-hmm.
There's kind of like an idea of what it should express, what kind of wine it should be. And this is the same in Italy, in Barolo, or in Sancerre in France, or in Austria, in, I don't know, Camptal or Wachau. So it's basically to help the consumer know what's in the wine, like what grapes go in there, what it should taste like, and so on.
So these are region-specific rules, like Vouvray Chambertin is a small little area in Burgundy. And so these wines of origin laws would define, like, as you said, grapes used, yields, like how much they can crop or harvest,
Exactly.
winemaking methods, I guess, things like that.
Exactly. So Gevrey-Chambertin, for example, can be only Pinot Noir. So if you happen to grow, I don't know, Gamay in your vineyards and you want to bottle Gamay from Gevrey-Chambertin, I actually don't know if anybody does it, but if they do, they would not be able to put Gevrey-Chambertin on the bottle, even though the grapes come from Gevrey-Chambertin.
Oh, okay.
Because the rules say that Gevrey-Chambertin is only made out of Pinot Noir.
Gotcha.
And you have, copy paste of this in many other regions. I think lately, some of these rules in certain regions, not in all of them, I think Burgundy is, for example, doing a pretty good job. Shiraz is doing a pretty good job. But, with the emergence of natural wine in the last, let's say, 15 years, I'm noticing some of the issues where some of the producers who I think are making incredible wines, and not just me, that these wines are praised by other reviewers, by other wine critics, they don't get to put the wine of origin for reasons that this grape is not allowed or this is not allowed. But things like the wine is cloudy and white wine cannot be cloudy, does not get designation of origin.
Okay.
So, for example, Martin and Anna Arndorfer, who we talked about earlier.
From Austria, yeah.
Exactly. None of their wines, even though they're in Kamptal, and they have like Erste Lage, which means Premier Cru in Austria. They have some great vineyards, and they are not allowed to put the name of these vineyards on the label. And it is because some of their wines are cloudy, or they make skin contact, or, people call it also orange wine. So they do basically white wines with prolonged skin contact. So this is not allowed to the law in the Kamptal. However, when you taste these wines, to me, they're very much Kamptal. They really express where they come from. And also some other conventional producers in the Kamptal agree with this. But the law is as such that this is not allowed. So on their bottle, it says wine from Austria. And that's it. Wine from Austria is a very vague thing to put on your bottle. It literally means nothing.
Right. And the less specific a wine is on the label, it sends a signal that it's usually of lower quality. It's as you get more and more specific,
exactly,
a region, a sub-region, right down to a vineyard, then you think, oh, well, they're being very specific here. The laws are stricter, so it must be a better wine.
Exactly. And I think rules are rules, sure. However, on the other side, there are wineries that make wine. So Martin and Arndorfer don't manipulate their wines in any way. They don't put any enzymes or any additives that are allowed in wine, and there are a lot of them that are allowed in wine. You'd be surprised. So there's nothing in that wine except for grapes that come from Kamptal, from their vineyards. And then there are producers who use all these tricks, who maybe acidify or add, enzymes, use industrial yeast that are created, sometimes they use champagne yeasts. So a lot of additives that don't come from Kamptal, but for whatever reason, somehow they still get this designation of origin that says Kamptal. And to me, logically thinking, wine that is made just from grapes with native yeast that come from Kamptal, so everything in this wine comes from Kamptal, to me deserves more to have Kamptal on the label than a wine that uses champagne yeast or some stabilizers, or is filtered, or you add enzymes, or you add acid, tartaric acid, or whatnot,
Yeah,
So
because yeast can change the flavor and nature of a wine too. Like, it has a very powerful impact.
absolutely. I mean, some research has been done that even if you took same grapes from the same vineyard and you made them in two different cellars, the wine would most likely turn to be different because ambient yeast of that very cellar or the barrel
around.
they're in.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Interesting. Wow.
Yeah.
So you're writing about this?
I actually have already written something about this, and it will be published in coming months.
In the Wine Enthusiast magazine. Well, we look forward to reading that.
Yes, thank you.
Sounds like an interesting issue.
Well, there you have it. I hope you enjoyed my chat with Aleks. Here are my takeaways. Number 1, I enjoyed the behind-the-scenes look at Alex's wine dream jobs with the Wine Spectator magazine and Sotheby's Fine Wine Auction House. 2, he had some very helpful tips on distinguishing real wine from fakes. 3, I agree with his tips on putting together flights of wine, especially tasting from the lightest to the heaviest. And 4, I thought it was interesting that Grand Cru vineyards don't have a lot of topsoil, and therefore the berries or the grapes have more concentration and the wine has more complexity. In the show notes, you'll find my email contact, the full transcript of my conversation with Aleks, links to his podcast and website, and where you can find the live stream video version of these conversations on Facebook and YouTube Live every Wednesday at 7 p.m. You'll also find a link to my free Ultimate Guide to Food and Wine Pairing. That's all in the show notes at nataliemaclean.com/205. Email me if you have a sip, tip, question, or want to be a beta reader of my new memoir at natalie@nataliemaclean.com. You won't want to miss next week when we continue our chat with Aleks. In the meantime, if you missed episode 27, go back and take a listen. I chat with San Francisco Chronicle wine columnist Esther Mobley, who also used to work at the Wine Spectator magazine. I'll share a short clip with you now to whet your appetite.
I used to use a voice recorder when I was doing in-person interviews. I stopped doing that a couple of years ago. Maybe I'm wrong, but I sensed that people spoke differently when they knew they were being recorded. So I just take notes by hand and then do a lot of follow-up if I need to check things. I'm a pretty fast writer. But when you're driving in the car, usually I'm in the passenger seat. And usually in those cases, I'm not writing at all, especially if we're like on a bumpy vineyard road. But I find that it's those long periods of time when you're not sitting at a table with wine in front of you, kind of intensely tasting, when you have a lot of extra time and you've gotten past the big questions and now you're just kind of chatting, that's when people open up. And I seek out those moments. It can take a lot longer than just picking up the phone and doing a quick interview. And frequently that's all I can do. I love that car time. I really think that's when the conversation gets rich.
If you liked this episode, please email or tell one friend about it this week, especially someone you know who'd be interested in the wines, tips, and stories we shared. Thank you for taking the time to join me here. I hope something great is in your glass this week. Or perhaps it's a flight of wines. You don't want to miss one juicy episode of this podcast, especially the secret, full-bodied bonus episodes that I don't announce on social media. So subscribe for free now at nataliemaclean.com/subscribe. Meet me here next week. Cheers.